Chinatown in downtown Toronto, a reflection of this city's diversity. But to be honest with you, in many ways, this is like a foreign place to me. Different food, different culture, a different language. But as far as language goes, if I don't share the words with the people in Chinatown, there is one language that we have in common, and that is the universal language of moving pictures. And that's what this program is about. We're going to take a look at the philosophy and the techniques used by editors to create effective visual presentations. Introduction to Editing is the first in a series of 3 programs. The second one will take a look at how to select an edit point, and the third will deal with sequencing. Each program will give us a slightly different view of the editor's world, and together it should give you a pretty good idea of what the editor's job is all about. So, let's begin. The Edit Suite. They come in more flavors than Baskin-Robbins ice cream. The sheer volume and variety of equipment, not to mention its cost, can be overwhelming. But really, editing isn't about this technology. You could train monkeys to push those buttons. The real job of an editor is to develop and control images and sounds. In news and current affairs, the raw materials that we use to put stories together are pictures, actuality, interviews, and script, with pictures being by far the most important part of the presentation. The funny thing is that when people start out, they put stories together in almost exactly the wrong order. First, they write and commit wholeheartedly to a script. After that, they go and they line up their interviews. While the interviews are in progress, they might by chance get some actuality. And finally, when they're all done, if there's any time left over, they'll shoot what they call B-roll, which is basically pictures or wallpaper to cover narration or script. Television is a visual medium. People remember stories that are developed visually. Can you remember one line of script from last night's newscast? How about one picture? So, what are the techniques used by an editor to handle these raw materials and transform them into a finished program? Today, we're going to talk about 6 of the basic techniques of editing. Continuity of action and continuity of time, simple guidelines for selecting and arranging images. Continuity of direction, sometimes called the axis, the 180-degree rule, or the optical barrier, another guideline to help present images in a way that the audience doesn't become confused. Time management, real power in editing. Using the same footage, techniques an editor can use to make a presentation last 10 seconds or 30 seconds. Pauses. Far from being nothing, pauses are essential to audience understanding and pacing. Pauses are a powerful dramatic device. Split edits. A look at how picture and sound edits do indeed have separate lives. These are some of the rules of the trade. Remember, though, that in editing, as in most other fields, rules are made to be broken. Just watch the rock video of your choice to see your favorite editing rule being thrown out the window. Still, though, these things are considered to be some of the conventions of the visual language. Well, we were okay up to a point there, but once Debbie got out here to the car, something began to go very wrong with our editing. What happened was we began to make our cuts during the time that actions were occurring on the screen.
putting the bucket on the ground is an action. We edited away from the bucket before the action was complete. Debbie begins to wash the car, and again, as she begins to work, we cheat the viewer by editing away during an action. While a good still photograph is static, a good TV shot is not. Good TV images often contain action or motion. These make for a more interesting presentation. Now, while these on-screen actions are occurring, they hold up a promise to the viewer at the end of the shot. As Debbie approached the driveway, we expected to see the bucket being placed on the ground. As she walked to the car, we expected and wanted to see her begin to wash the car. Each action as it began held a promise for the viewer, but originally we didn't deliver. Normally, we never edit away from a shot during a significant motion. We must wait for the action to finish and then edit away from it. This is something that camera operators in particular have to be aware of. In the field, to stop shooting just as a major action has begun creates a very jarring shot. During a pan or zoom, we almost never edit before the movement is complete. If we do, then once again, we've broken our promise with the viewer. We were taking them somewhere with the camera movement and then backed out at the last moment. In editing, we don't do this. Once we've made a promise to the viewer, we have to keep it, or the audience is going to be disappointed. Another set of images that are almost correct. A moment ago we talked about continuity of action. This was a principle that helped us determine what part of a shot to use. Now we're going to talk about continuity of time, or chronology, and this principle will help us determine what order to use our shots in. We all have a natural sense of order. We comprehend better if we sense a flow, a progression in the images we're watching. Pictures presented in random order are difficult for the brain to organize and understand. Because of this, when we're editing, our job is to present our images in an order that makes sense. And one of the simplest ways to do this is to make sure that they're being presented in correct chronological order. For example, we could choose to tell the story of a day in the life, or 48 hours with the RCMP, or Billy gets a haircut. In all of these cases, once the timeline is established, selection of images is actually quite simple. Our pictures have to be presented in an order that makes sense, one in which there appears to be a progression in the images, in effect, in a logical and chronological order. While this may seem obvious now, consider an item about the high cost of electrical power. Some of the items that I've seen, you're just as likely at the top of that item to see the lineman up the pole, and then later on in the program to see the lineman pulling up at the same location. Now this can be rationalized away by saying that the lineman's pulling up at a different location later on. The fact is, it's not as effective a use of your pictures as if they were used in the correct chronological order. And let's not forget the most common way to break chronology in an item, and that would be to use the same picture twice. Now this is a cheat that seldom goes unnoticed by the audience, who quite obviously feel that they're being jumped back in time. Chronology is a very simple concept, yet it's important, and it's quite natural. Our desire for a correct chronology in our stories comes to us out of our storytelling backgrounds, and in fact, that's what an editor is,
a storyteller.
Another edited presentation that disturbs the viewer, this time because of a break in continuity of direction. Now this results from breaking a rule or a guideline, sometimes called the axis or the 180-degree rule. When we watch television, we get a lot of information from the direction in which somebody's looking. For example, at a news conference, people looking in one direction are assumed to be at the head table. Anybody looking in the other direction is assumed to be in the audience looking at the head table. So you can see that we make a lot of assumptions about people and events based on their screen direction. As Elliot rides his bicycle, he's headed left. All the shots match in direction. They build a feeling that Elliot is moving with a single purpose to a new location. Suddenly we have this shot. What's happening? Has Elliot turned around? Is this his twin brother on a collision course? When we break continuity of direction in this way, we create questions and confusion in the mind of the viewer. This is often considered to be a shooting and an editing mistake. When shooting in the field, there's an imaginary line called the axis. In this case, it runs straight through Elliot and his bicycle, in line with the direction of motion. As long as we stay on one side of this line, Elliot will continue to look the same way in the frame. All shots taken on this side of the line will have continuity of direction. As the camera crosses the axis, all of a sudden, Elliot appears to have changed direction. We have disrupted the continuity. In the field, camera operators try as much as possible to maintain control over the axis. In fact, one of the very first questions that has to be asked when arriving at a new location is, where is the axis? Look at the typical news conference. The room has presenters at the head table and the press and the public in the audience. We draw an imaginary line perpendicular to the head positions or eye lines of the people in the room. This is the axis. If we take all the shots from one side of the axis, we won't confuse the audience. We can tell just by the direction that somebody is looking whether they're at the head table or in the audience. If we throw in one shot from across the axis, we have the potential for a momentary confusion that will disrupt the flow of images. So, does this mean that we can never cross the axis? We try not to, but life isn't fair, and sometimes we have to cross the axis. Now, we can cross the axis in real life quite simply. For example, at that news conference, if somebody got up and simply walked across the room, they would cross the axis. Or even as you watch right now, all I have to do is shift my body position, and now I appear to have crossed the axis. But in either of these cases, an observer doesn't get confused because the axis crossing has been gradual and clearly observed. And that's what we have to do with our editing in situations where we have to cross the axis. We must make the axis crossing gradual. We cross the axis by first using a neutral shot. This lessens the shock of the axis crossing and separates the conflicting images. One of the things we look for when screening our footage is the dominant screen direction in a scene. And if there's a crossing of the axis, we're going to look especially hard for a neutral shot that we can use to avoid confusing the audience. Now, if all of this talk about the axis seems absolutely clear, you're in for a surprise. Because in the field and in the edit suite, there are lots of situations where the axis is far from clear. You're going to have to work at it. And last, remember, the axis is a guideline. It's not an unbreakable rule. King and Bay Streets, the center of Canada's financial power, and a place to talk about the absolute power that an editor has over time. These images were shot in isolation. What I mean is that we didn't know how long they would have to last on screen to cover this voiceover. This is entirely typical. A series of images may need to cover 10 seconds or 30 seconds, and there's no way to know which when you're in the field. Part of the editor's job is not to accept the length of a scene as it comes from the field, but to craft the length of the scene as is appropriate. We may have to lengthen a scene to match a program requirement. We may have to shorten the length of a scene because it's boring and too long. So, how do we control time? Well, there are a couple of ways. For example, we could just drop an individual shot, or in fact a whole group of shots. What we could do is edit from me entering the building, eliminate all the footage that we shot in the lobby, and cut directly to me entering this observation area. Now, the shot taken outside the main building, you'll notice that I was allowed to completely leave the frame. And this is important. An editor will learn very quickly that when the subject leaves the frame, they have a prime opportunity to perform time management. The reason is, of course, that when the frame is empty, we've got a chance to cut to almost anything. Oh, Daniel has a problem. Another way to control time is to shorten repetitive actions so that we can compress our scenes. For example, repairing a bicycle tire. This process takes about 6 minutes, but we need to shorten it to somewhere around 40 seconds. This is going to require two things in your footage: a variety of camera angles and some cutaways. If we have these elements, we can shorten this scene. To see how well this can work, keep an eye on the camera original in the upper left as we edit. We allow the action to establish in the wide shot. As Daniel begins to work on the tire, we cut to a close-up, because it's a lot more interesting to be able to see what his hands are doing. Now comes the good part. We edit to a cutaway, a shot of Daniel's face. When we cut back to the hands, voila! We've smoothly jumped forward in time. 2 pulls on the tube, and we cut to a wide shot, again compressing the action by moving forward. We edit to a still wider shot, advancing the action for a 3rd time. With these 3 edits, we've got the tube out of the tire, and we've edited 6 minutes down to 40 seconds. We've also eliminated all the repetition in these shots. Meanwhile, on the field tape, Daniel is still trying to get the tire off the rim. When we edit a scene together, its length should be appropriate to the pacing and content of the item. And it's the principles of time management that we use to do this. Rarely are we going to take footage from the field and edit it to the full length that some action actually took. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to craft that scene to whatever length we think is appropriate. Now, to do time management, we need a certain type of footage. We need a variety of shots, taken from a couple of different angles. We need shots in which the subject is exiting the frame, and possibly a few in which they're entering the frame as well. And we certainly need a variety of cutaways and close-ups. With this kind of footage, we're going to have a lot of editing opportunities. So what kind of footage can present problems for time management? The editor's enemies, zooms and pans. The problem with this kind of camera move is that once it's begun, it's very difficult to edit out of. Now, there's nothing wrong with the zoom or a pan if it's motivated. But the problem is most often they're not motivated and they're uneditable. So, time management, a powerful tool in the hands of a skilled editor. Jules Verne would be envious.
It's going to be very difficult for us to endorse anything that doesn't address Aboriginal issues.
The feeling I have is that the promotion questioned isn't the end-all and be-all for Quebec.
If it's a unanimous report, great. That adds to the report. It's not. The report will still reflect, I think, what's important in terms of this.
Prison, a place where people are sent for crimes against society. But in this particular case, crimes against television. The presentation that you were just looking at was largely incomprehensible to a general audience, and that's a crime. The man who edited that presentation is in here, and we've come to have a talk to him to find out exactly what his crime was. Hi, Bob.
Hi.
Hi. Bob, I wonder if you could tell us exactly what it is that you did to end up in here.
I edit TV news. One night I was putting together an item. We were less than 5 minutes to air. My director came on the intercom and said it would be a good move for my career if I finished this item before we went on air. I was laying in a clip at the time, and the guy in camera stopped speaking. I instinctively marked it in without even really thinking about it. Maybe at the time I knew it didn't feel right, but I didn't stop and fix it. Next day, my director took me aside. He went to screen the item, and he thought it was too tight, and I could sort of see what he said. And then I think I began to understand that...
Bob, you're still editing without pauses. We need pauses. Look, when you read a newspaper, you start at the top and you're reading, but you stop, you go back, you reread whole sections, you pause. And it's during these pauses that you've got an opportunity to follow arguments, formulate opinions, make up your own mind about issues. In television, we have no such opportunity. Information is being fed to us at a rate that we can't control. If too much information comes at us too quickly, we don't have time to process it, and our brain, in effect, sort of shuts down. We become a passive spectator in front of the TV set. Not only do we like pauses, but they're absolutely essential for comprehension. That's why we tend to like, quite naturally, those little actuality pauses in our items, or those short visual sequences without narration. Another reason that we need pauses is that they often give us information that we can't get any other way. Now, take an interview, for example. It seems that we don't always speak just with words. The blink of an eye, the twitch of a facial muscle, or the pursing of somebody's lips can often give us as much information as a whole paragraph full of words. Pauses have dramatic effect. Now, some editors don't realize this, and they make their edits after the words. Learn to listen, not just to the words, but to the mood and to the pictures themselves, because often what they have to say is just as important, or even more so, than the words themselves. So, we're going to try that one more time, and this time I'd like you to pay attention to the pauses, okay? Give it a try.
I edit TV news. One night I was putting together an item. We were less than 5 minutes to air. My director came on the intercom and said it would be a good move for my career if I finished this item before we went on air. At the time, I was laying in a clip. The guy in camera stopped talking, and I instinctively marked it in without even really thinking about it. Maybe at the time, I knew it didn't feel right, but I didn't stop and fix it. The next day, my director took me aside. He went to screen the item, and he thought it was too tight, and I could sort of see what he said. I think I began to understand that, you know...
Now, didn't that feel better?
I had no idea it was that important, and that it could make such a difference.
Good. You're going to do fine. Lack of pauses is much more serious than these simple examples might illustrate. It's a clear sign that not enough attention is being paid to the mood, to the pacing, or to the overall picture portion of the presentation. Lack of pauses are a clear sign of editing by numbers rather than skill. Don't let this happen to you.
You know, I think there's a design flaw here. The video and the audio buttons, they're too close together. A novice editor might get the idea that they're to be used at the same time. They might think that there's nothing wrong with an edit in which video and audio are recording together. But is it really okay to do this?
Daniel, a lot of people think that a bicycle is purely for pleasure. Is that what you're using yours for?
No, I use it to go to and from school every day.
I understand that you and your friends have another couple of interests in common as well, specifically IBM computers. What are you using those for?
I set up my modem so my friends can call it, and we get transfer files, games and programs and word processors and all sorts of files.
Well, that's one way to edit this footage, but I don't think it's the best way. Did you notice that every edit was a picture and a sound cut? Now, this is very predictable editing. It's also quite unnatural. Very rarely in our everyday life does the motivation for a picture cut exactly match the motivation for an audio cut. Now, what do I mean by this? Imagine that you're watching two people engaged in a conversation. As the conversation proceeds, you're looking from one person to the other. In fact, you're editing with your eyes. What you'll notice is that you don't move your head from one person to the other at the end of one question to the beginning of an answer. In fact, your head turns are going to be staggered between the questions and answers. Why does this happen? Well, it's very simple, really. When somebody is speaking, we often know what they're going to say before, you know what I mean. When a question is being asked, there comes a point in the delivery when the viewer knows what's going to be said. From that point on, they don't feel they're going to be receiving any new information. And it's at this point that they want their picture cut, that they're motivated to see the reaction of the person receiving the question. And that's because the true answer to the question can begin long before a word is spoken. You can see it on the face of the person preparing to answer. Split edits work because they accurately reflect the way that we perceive things in our lives. The fact that split edits aren't being done more often, I think, is due in large part to the fact that many people are not thinking about picture and sound as separate elements. When editing film, picture and sound are on separate reels. This makes it very simple for a film editor to think about them as separate elements. But in videotape, all we have are those small little buttons. And sometimes we forget that you can slip an audio track, or that we can enter an audio edit point offset from video. But if you want your edits to be smooth, you have to begin to think about picture and sound as separate elements.
Daniel, a lot of people think that a bicycle is purely for pleasure. Is that what you're using yours for?
No, I use it to go to and from school every day.
I understand that you and your friends have another couple of interests in common as well, specifically IBM computers. What are you using those for?
I set up my modem so my friends can call it, and we get transfer files.
Split edits. They give quite a smooth product, and now each edit point is disguised. It's hidden under a seamless presentation. So far, we've been talking about split edits for interviews, but they're useful in other editing situations as well. I'd like to show you two other examples. First, have a look at this cut. While this transition may be what you're looking for, most often we're going to want to make it a bit smoother. In this case, we've used a split edit to advance the sound of the airplane over the previous shot. In doing this, the sound of the airplane alerts the audience to the fact that a picture cut is coming up. Now this will lessen the shock value of the edit and result in a much smoother transition. And that's one of the other things that we use split edits for, to smooth out what might otherwise be abrupt picture changes. Now, there's one other thing that we use split edits for. Have a look at this.
The most difficult part of changing the tire is taking the outer rim off, the outer tire off the tube.
Here we have a continuity problem. How can a split edit help? Let's take a look.
The most difficult part of changing the tire is taking the outer rim off, the outer tire off the tube.
So, split edits are often used in this manner to hide continuity problems. By advancing the sound of the interview over the wide shot, we help prepare the audience for the upcoming shot change. And when it occurs, it appears much smoother. So, there you have it, split edits. Something very simple to do in film because of the mechanics involved. Something a little more difficult to do on tape, also because of the mechanics involved. But just because split edits can be a little bit more difficult on tape doesn't make them any less effective. In fact, split edits are still the hallmark of a good editor. A good editor is always thinking about picture and sound as separate elements. So, split edits are a tool for smoother editing. Now, if we could just move some of these buttons so people would begin to think about video and audio as separate elements. Any program on the universal visual language is going to fall short of explaining all of its intricacies. What we've tried to do in this program is introduce you to a few specific techniques, really as a way to help you get your feet wet in thinking about editing. We would, however, like you to take away some important points from this program. When putting programs together, remember the continuities. When selecting shots, continuity of action is a principle that will help you select the proper portion of a shot to use. Continuity of time, or chronology, is a way to provide a structure, a flow to an item that will please the audience. The axis, sometimes called continuity of direction, is a principle to help put shots together, back to back, in a way that the audience will not become confused about what's going on in the scene. Time management. An editor controls time. He crafts footage to fit the required length, sometimes for matching a voiceover, but far better editors control time so they can control pacing, emphasis, and interest. We need shots with subjects entering and leaving the frame. We need close-ups and a variety of angles in order to control time. Pauses. Stay out of video jail. Don't underestimate the power of the pause. Pauses are needed by the audience to understand the information you're presenting, and pauses in on-camera clips are not dead space. Often they say more than the words themselves. Split edits. Video and audio do not naturally belong together. Think about video and audio as separate elements. Use split edits to smooth out your presentations, to soften abrupt edits, and to cover continuity problems. These techniques and guidelines will serve you well, whether you're editing an interview or a feature film. Use them when assembling the basic elements of information programming, which are, of course, pictures, actuality, interviews, and finally, script. Editing is a field worthy of lifelong study.
If you'd like to learn more about editing, what you've got to do is begin to analyze feature films and think carefully about those programs on television that you consider particularly effective. You might also like to look at the next 2 programs in this series, Selecting an Edit Point and Sequencing. We'll see you next time.